will be we're recording the session because we're going to put it into the ASA YouTube channel so that we can share that later on. And so I would like to welcome everybody here today with us. My name is Iris Buder, and on behalf of the Association of Social Economics, or for Social Economics, I should say, I'd like to welcome everybody on this webinar on growing up free from violence and abuse. And with us today, we have Dr. Karen Sternflug, and we have Dr. Patricia Bell as well. And so this webinar is going to focus on the impact of domestic violence on children and child-related social costs of growing up with intimate partner violence. So with us today, again, we have Dr. Karen Sternflug, and she's an economist with a degree from the University of Vienna, Austria. She's a researcher at the Institute for Advanced Studies, lecturer at the Universities of Vienna and Klagenfurt, and a staff member of FH Campus Public Management, Vienna. Also with us today, we have Dr. Patricia Bell. Dr. Bell has worked against sexualized violence against women and children in the home for over 40 years as a researcher, activist, and in feminist projects in Austria, England, Germany, and Scotland. She initiated the GoFOA project and was responsible for coordinating the international meetings and writing the training manual. So thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I will now hand the floor over to you.
Great. So I'm Patricia Bell. I'm speaking to you today from southern Germany, and I'm sorry my voice is a little scratchy. I'm COVID positive, but at least we can meet online without any worries. So I'm just going to put up a PowerPoint presentation. I'll be doing an introduction to the, let me just, oh yeah, there it is. And I need it on the, how do I get it on the presentation mode? Yeah, Bildschirm Präsentation. Okay, good. Good. So the GoFOA project, I'll move straight on. I've left you here the website address because all the material that we produced as deliverables for the project are available as free downloads. That includes Karen's Excel sheet and the explanation of how she worked out the sums. And it's a training manual for professionals on how to work with children who may be living with violence in the home. And each of the modules and everything is all there, free to download in English and German, Danish, and Serbian. And we're waiting for the translator to be finished, translating a version into Ukrainian. So all those languages will soon be available. But I'll move straight on to the next slide, where we can get on to the content of the project. We just need to figure out how to do this. Good. So it was funded by the European Union. Now, all the data that I'm going to be giving about, and I have sort of put in statistics on incidents, etc., in the course of my talk, just to give you a general overview. This all relates to data, of course, for Europe. Usually English or British or German data or Austrian data. Good. So we had women's shelter children's workers. They're highly qualified specialists who work with children in shelters and are really experts in providing this service for children. Statutory child protection services, that is in Germany, the Jugendamt, and in Britain, it's the, well, I've forgotten what it's called in Austria, sorry, but it's the social services, but they are responsible for child welfare or from a state perspective. And then various other governmental agencies that represent children's and women's interests and child advocates. They joined us from Austria, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Denmark, England, and Germany. This mixture was really quite good. I don't know how far you are aware in the United States, but within the the Council of Europe, which is larger than the European Union, there is something called the Istanbul Convention, which sets standards for providing services. And most countries in Europe are signed up to this convention. Turkey has recently just left, unfortunately, but other European countries, EU members in any case, are signed up to it and are in the process of ratifying it, ratifying the recommendations of, for example, one shelter space for each 10,000 women in the population, as a sort of standard of what should be made available. All information about the Istanbul Convention, again, you can find the link to that in the manual if you look. Yeah. We were looking at the children's rights perspective. We wanted to approach the problem from the perspective of children. And we also looked at the child's ongoing relationship with the mother and father. We had a series of international meetings of the team and ran pilot training courses, which are the modules that we developed for the manual in England, Austria, and Germany. So the aim was to improve services and to improve the training of professionals. And Karen's part, which she will go on to talk to in more detail, which was to calculate the costs and how that can be done. So just to sketch the scale of the problem, I am assuming that the situation in the United States will be similar to the situation in Europe. This figure of about 25% of women experiencing domestic violence at some point in their lives is a fairly average figure. It comes originally from German research, but other research projects in other European countries have borne that figure out more or less. So that's a sort of a very rough figure. What is quite important is that a lot of those women have children living with them at the time. And the police reports in Germany are that around half of all cases that police are called to, that is really, I mean, that is sort of quite bad domestic violence by the time the police get called out. Of course, there's an awful lot of domestic violence that never gets reported to the police. But in incidents where the police are called out, it represents about half of their call outs. In Germany and Austria, the police must report those incidents to the child protection services. And in some places in Britain, that also happens. That we'll come on to that later because that has got very specific consequences. What happens then is that a support agency will then contact the victim and talk to her about what options she has available to her if she's experiencing violence in the home. So we estimate, and this came originally, this 30% of children exposed to domestic violence at some point in their childhood. That came from research in Switzerland, but again, there isn't any evidence that that doesn't more or less apply to the British and the general European situation. I do have to mention that domestic violence reports and violence against children reports are slightly higher in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We can come on to that later about why that might be the case. One very important finding that has been found in many research projects here in Europe is that, and I've got a feeling this is common in the United States as well, is that domestic violence often begins or escalates around the birth of the first child. Now, I'm going to briefly talk about some of the consequences for children, just so that you can get a very rough impression of what the scale of the problem is. Of course, there can be damage to the child before birth. That's one thing that has to be remembered, that if a woman is experiencing violence during her pregnancy, this causes certain enzymes to be released into her out of fear and anxiety and worry that can impact on the fetus. It's also important to remember that pregnancy may be a result of sexual assault. And so there might be a problem with mother-child bonding because of those two factors. So that can be that from the very start, there might be difficulties in the mother-child relationship. But it's very important to point out that this really can't be stressed enough. that the act of mothering may serve as a trigger for abuse and violence, or it may be used as a pretext that women will be criticized from spending too much time with the children, giving the children too much attention, not giving the children enough attention, not being strict enough, to being too lenient, whatever. In fact, when we look at the research, we can see that anything that women do can be used as a pretext for violence, but quite often her role as a mother will be attacked, and that she will be systematically undermined. This is very significant because it destroys mothers for children as somebody that they can turn to, because she is undermined within her own home. So going on to look very quickly, there's much more information about this in the manual, but the children will hear and see sexual and verbal violence and physical violence. Now, this will be the case even if women say, well, I always made sure that they were out of the room before things kicked off, that you'll find that children actually know what's going on. They will hear things, they'll pick up on the atmosphere in the home, even when people think that women think they're hiding it. That children are deliberately or accidentally injured. I mean, accidental injuries can happen if the woman happens to be holding a small child in her arms at the point at which she is assaulted. The child might be inadvertently injured in that. But it can also be that children might try and protect their mother and get in between their mother and the perpetrator and be injured. Or that children are sometimes deliberately injured as a way of putting pressure onto their mothers to comply with whatever. And it's very important to note that in research that's been done in Britain, where where people have reanalyzed case files of reported child injuries in the home, that's violence against children, when you look for domestic violence, that 30 to 60% of reported child injuries reported to the child protection services will also have an element of intimate partner violence in the home as well. That is a very important statistic, because it is the case that children who grow up with domestic violence are also more at risk of physical and sexual violence in the home as well. Good, so children can develop all sorts of problems, sleeping, eating, developing speech, can have all sorts of trauma signals. And then there's the more sort of social points that I think are very important to mention, is that they may have to take on too much responsibility for their siblings and their mother, and this might be something that may increase over time, and this can cause resentment and can also lead to children blaming their mother for that. They might not blame the perpetrator. So older children may avoid being at home. That leaves them at risk of other injuries or other dangerous behavior that they can become involved in when they're hanging around on the street, for example. Very often nobody will be talking to the child in the home about what is happening. Partly people don't talk to children because they think they're protecting them, but in fact, children very often know that something's going on, but they don't know what. So they can very often have very false ideas that it's their fault, they cause it, particularly if it's some aspect of mothering that has been the pretext for an assault, that children would think that they are to blame. The mother, of course, is distracted by the violence and trying to live with a violent partner. She may also have injuries, be depressed, and she may be using alcohol or other medication or illegal substances to self-medicate to cope with the pressure. All of this will actually contribute to the mother being unavailable for the child. Children may then, none of this has to happen, but obviously all of it can happen, and there is obviously a difference in the frequency and severity of the violence in the home, and so I don't want to say that everybody who lives with any domestic violence will suffer from all of these things, not at all, but just to give you an impression of the range of problems that children will display and have as a result of living with domestic violence. And so children may lack respect for their mother. They may see the mother as being responsible for provoking the perpetrator, for not yeah, for not being able to control his behavior, for marrying him in the first place, for staying with him. Similarly, she could also be blamed when she leaves him. Children might not be happy with that decision, or if she returns to him. And to bear in mind that some children might live with this pattern of leaving and returning more than once before the relationship finally ends, if it does. The other problem is that women who are experiencing domestic violence will go to great lengths to hide it because they're maybe embarrassed or ashamed that they're not able to leave or not having the happy family that they would like to project. And this can result in the family becoming very isolated. There may be very few adults around, there may be none present in the home who can talk to children about what's happening, rather than the mother who's trying to not talk about it because she's protecting them, or she doesn't know what to say, or the perpetrator who may be giving explanations that it's all their mother's fault or whatever. So children can end up being quite isolated and lonely in that they don't have an adult that they can turn to talk about their problems. And the biggest problem that I found, my research started off looking at sexual violence against children in the family and why did they not confide in their mothers. And then the issue of domestic violence was an obvious way that women were in fact made less effective in being able to protect their children, and children sometimes saw that their mother couldn't protect herself, how could she protect them? And that children learn in families where violence is not spoken about, that problems, violence or abuse that you're experiencing is something that you just keep quiet about and you don't talk to people, not even in your own family. So we get to the point of parental separation. So at last the parents are separated and there may be a lot of relief about this. It's also very important to remember that some children do not want to be separated from their father, and that can be the case even if violence has been in the home and they have witnessed it. But children can also be upset about their lives being disrupted, friendship networks, if they have to change school or whatever. If children go into shelters, often an issue that they're not allowed to take pets with them. They can't invite friends because the address of the shelter is confidential, so they can't invite people to their home. And again, if this is something that they've experienced over many times, that their relief in the violence being stopped, in that the parents are no longer occupying the same space, still they might have very mixed feelings about it. And then it's also the grief that they may really mourn for living with their father, or for the fact that they don't have the ideal of a happy family home. There might also be shame and fear. And of course, fear about what might happen in the future. Yes. And then to talk about the perpetrators, one of the problems is that perpetrators are very seldom confronted. The only people who confront the perpetrators about what they do is the police. And there is, I don't know what the situation is in the United States, but the prosecution of perpetrators in England and Wales was between 12 and 16%. In a research project that was conducted there. And in Germany, there was a research project done about convictions for domestic violence, where they found that approximately 8% of reported cases were actually resulted in a conviction. Of course, we can't know how many of the reported cases are a total of the whole. This is a problem that is very often shrouded in silence and secrecy. The other problem that children have is that violence and abuse can continue despite separation. This might be particularly at points of handover of the children, that their mother may be assaulted, but it can also be control in terms of money being forthcoming, or in difficulties about the contact between the parents, which I'll come on to in a moment. The Ravi Tiara and Chris Harrison, who also worked on the project and worked on the manual with me, have also developed the concept of the absent presence as being a sort of a malignant effect that can stay in the family even when the partner, the violent partner, is removed, that the violence and abuse might continue. Partly it could, somebody, for example, be in harassment about contact arrangements. Looking at contact arrangements, it's important to point out that 85% of parents who separated agree to contact without any court case. Now, this was research that was done in Britain by Mariana Hester, but it was also similar research was done in Sweden by Maria Eriksson. It's important to note that most families agree to contact initially. It's important to see that it's not that from the outside people say, no, he can't see the children, that this desire to stop some men seeing their children is something that develops, and that within 2 years, many of these arrangements that they agree on amicably break down. Of course, not in all cases. In many families, even in families where there's been domestic violence, they may be able to amicably agree. And what I think is missing from this statistic, which is a point that I always think about, is that there are children who desperately want to see their father and their father doesn't want to see them. Now, that is something that, although we talk a lot about children's rights, that you never hear about that in family courts. It's always the other way around. And there are a lot of children who lose contact with their fathers, and they don't want to. The fathers find it difficult or can't or won't or have no interest in maintaining contact. And children really are not able to do anything about that. It's also important to note that in Britain, in Britain and Germany and Austria, there is similarly a series of family courts. Most European countries have got something similar. The family courts make decisions about these kind of cases because they're not criminal cases, but they can be very, very difficult and very hotly contested. Sometimes courts will make a court order to say there has to be contact. Quite often, if it's a difficult situation, they'll say supervised. That's supervised by a social worker usually from the child protection agencies, or a similar organization. And in the hope that, unsupervised contact, the relationship will get better. Well, this actually does not happen. And about only 60% of court orders for supervised contact actually lead to sustainable relationship. The rest break down again and again and again. And you have a situation where some families, it's the family court is a revolving door. They're going out with unworkable arrangements that nobody can live with. It breaks down and it comes back to the court. And this is a problem. There's been several reports written on this, which are referred to in the manual. Now, the kind of problem that children have when they're trying to deal with this is that they might be used by one or both parents. They might be questioned by their father. What is their mother doing? Who's she meeting? Is she going out? Is she staying home in the evenings? What's going on? It's important to note that sometimes it can be from both parents, that the mother might also be questioning the child about what's it like at your dad's, who's there, who's coming to visit, whatever. It's clear that children have to bear the brunt of parental conflict. And this is a real problem because, as I point out, good child contact requires good communication and flexibility because rigid arrangements limit child freedom. But if parents can't communicate this, sometimes very rigid arrangements are imposed by the court in order to be fair to both parents, that both of them can have contact to the child, but the children is then left bearing the brunt of this conflict. And this can manifest in lots of ways. It can be arguments about money, who's paying for what, something's come up, there's a need for extra money, and that the child will be sent to speak to your father about this, or speak to your mother about it. And children are we're leaving children to deal with this, these conflicts that, the two adults concerned are not able to agree on. So this isn't at all easy for children. It can result in very difficult conflicts of loyalty for children. And there's also the case that children may experience ongoing verbal and physical and sexual abuse during contact arrangements. They may not, but it's very difficult if there are allegations made It has to always be very concrete with proof in order to stop contact. And having worked for a lot of time on the problem of sexual violence against children, there's a lot of sexual violence against children can happen without leaving any visible traces whatsoever. So it can be a very difficult situation. The other problem is that the quality of the contact isn't monitored. And I'm just moving on now to the last. Oh, I've jumped one. How do I get back? How do I get back? Can I do a backspace? Oh. Oh no, yeah, family courts. So one of the problems we have with the family courts, and this is done based on research again from Marianne Hester, is that the family courts say, okay, we have to be fair to the parents. We have to, children have a right to, parents have a right to see their children have a right to see their parents. We have to be focused on the future and arrange this. And they refuse to engage with what they define as relationship problem of the parents without understanding that the magnitude of violence that a child might be living with has had severe impacts on their relationship with both parents. And that it's not possible for the family court really to ignore it. There is also the idea that we have to be fair. And this has resulted in Germany, this is a very current issue in some parts of Germany, of what they call the 50-50 model, where children live 50% with one parent and 50% with the other. They're at home with both parents. And this can work, this model can work, particularly where families are good at communicating. But if they're not good at communicating, this is a very bad model to try and impose, because it leads to a whole range of children. And the children are left sort of not belonging in any one place and having to deal with a lot of conflicted contact. I'll move now on just to the last one because I've gone over my time. The points that I want to make is that freedom is more than an end to violent assault, because sometimes the focus is on getting the parents separated, stopping the physical assaults, and everything will be okay. That isn't the solution in relationships where there has been embedded violence and abuse going on for many years. One-parent families are relatively poor. I think that's true anywhere in the world. And it's an issue that never actually gets adequately dealt with. And so that is also a very difficult issue for women who are contemplating leaving a partner, particularly women who have been used to a higher standard of living, that you know that your children are going to be severely disadvantaged. There is an ideological commitment to shared parenting in Europe at the moment, but this is not at all in practical terms supported. There is very little practical support for shared parenting. Actually, I could say that there isn't any practical support for shared parenting, but following a divorce, this is the goal that family courts will try and reach. There is very little sanction of domestic violence perpetrators. We've seen that, so that children are being, their mother is put under pressure. You cannot allow your children to be exposed to this kind of violence. This is what will happen when many reports that the police have been called out to a family for domestic violence arrive at the children protection services. They will contact the victim and say, you cannot expose your child to this violence. If the violence is very severe, they'll say you have to leave or we're taking the children. Women in that situation may leave not of their own free will, but they feel under duress that they have to leave. And then within a week, the same child protection services will arrive and say, now you have to send them to their father every second week. And this might be somebody who has never been challenged on his violence except by the police at the call out. And as we see, he doesn't have to fear prosecution. There was one other point that I wanted to mention. Yes, that women are held responsible. In effect, women are held responsible because men aren't held responsible. And one of the problems is that women are held responsible for ensuring that their child attends court-ordered contact. Now, if a child is being abused or is being abused when they're forced to go to contact with their father, and they really don't want to go, the person who makes them go is their mother. Now, in these instances, children can end up losing faith and confidence in both parents. Basically, they have no one to turn to. And the family courts have said here that they engage in child abuse, which is a very severe comment. It's based actually on a quote from an Austrian judge who says, yes, sometimes we have to order that a child goes every second week to their father. And we can see that this is torturing the child, but it's only until they're 14 and then it's all over. Now, anybody who knows anything about child development and child psychology knows if you regularly torture a child until they're 14, it's not going to be over. They will be psychologically scarred for life. So my claim is that children learn from this, a state which supports patterns of abusive masculinity and constrained femininity. Good. All right, I've got us through a whole load of it, and that was the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time. So I have to go out of shared screening now, stop share, and turn off my, I assume I have to turn myself off, yeah?
Okay. Thank you, Patricia. Now I have to find my thing. That's weird. There we go. Huh. That's really strange. Give me 1 second. There we are. Okay, great. I had too many windows open on my screen, so here we go. Thank you so much, Patricia, for your bid. There we go. Being an economist and not working in that field, it was kind of a challenge. How can I support Patricia and her work, right? And what can I do to be any help for the project? Because this kind of demanded an economist be a part of the project. So that was going to be me. And I was wondering, what can I do? So Patricia, as she said, she was engaging in making this manual that you can get from the website, which will help the women, mostly women working in the shelters, with finding strategies to support the children better. And very often this is based on scarce resources. So this is where I'm coming in. I'm thinking, okay, scarce resources is a problem economists deal with, and we should find solutions how to make the greatest and most efficient solutions for this type of problem. So I'm focusing on this year that is highlighted in red. So I thought these women who are working so hard for these poor children, it would be very helpful for them to get good funding for projects that might benefit those children affected by violence. And so I wanted to build a convincing economic tool to be of use for shelter workers going to government officials, for instance, or even to private benefactors and saying, look, if you give me a little bit of money, it will do so much good. So this, of course, poses a difficult problem. Usually economic analysis is very complex. We do complicated figures, we do formula, we do huge data files, and people are generally scared and intimidated and don't want anything to do with it. So my aim was to make it very, very simple on the one side so that it would be easily understood. But on the other side, it can't be too simple. Otherwise, the policymakers will say, you just pulled those numbers out of your hat, right? And you lose credibility, and then you don't get that much funding either, probably. So yeah, so this is where I was standing. And I have illustrated my slides with these little cartoons you see here, and they come from a Norwegian film artist, Anita Kelly, and she has kindly allowed us to use stills from her movies little cartoon movies. And if you're in the field working with violence and children, these are really good films to watch. They're very, very helpful. So, okay. If you want to talk about violence and the costs of the violence on the first side, basic problems, as Patricia has been saying, is, you have these effects of the violence in that moment. And then even when the violence stops, say the violent partner has moved out, or even the court can't force the children anymore to see perpetrators, it's the question, what can we count? What is it that we count? The hours the child spent crying in the room, how much is that worth? Do we just count it on the day where it happened, or do we count future effects? Do we stop counting when the child grows up, or do we keep track the whole lifetime? And who is actually paying these costs? Is it the child himself or herself later? Is it the parents? Is it the taxpayer? Who is it? And what do we include? And how do we measure these abstract things? So the basic problems of an economist looking into all types of violence, and this from the social security like problems. If you have an insurance claim, how much is it worth if you lose a leg, right? It's not a good question. So there are 3 different major ways to look into it. So you could look at the costs within a time frame. Okay, so like you say, within 1 year. So how much was that happening here at that time, usually when that abuse took place? Or you could say, we could look at the incidence-based approach, where you say, okay, as Patricia said, even when it stops at the age of 14, how does it go on? Maybe the child will then have other problems at school, won't get a good job, or start having unhealthy behavior that also incur costs in the health industry, etc. Or you look at the lifetime, and you look at, what will happen in the whole lifetime of that child. And this is where we came in and we said, okay, we're just going to look at the whole lifetime and not just about here a specific generation, so also like the time when it happened. Then I already spoke about it. Who will bear the costs? Is it private costs for the household, or is it the community costs that society pays, or is it what the businesses will lose? Say your employees, they will be needing extra support, they're ill more often, so it also makes costs in private businesses. But we chose to focus more in this analysis on community and third-party costs. So how to find the total cost? Easy exercise for economists who are totally trained to do it. Total cost is price times amount of these incurring costs. So let's start with looking at the amount. Where do we find data for the prevalence of this violence? Patricia already gave you a little bit of figures at the start, say 25% of the mothers will experience this. So you could look at literature, you could see what's already out there, you could look at surveys in the national statistics. And here are some examples for good sources for data. For instance, EU data that gives data for EU countries is this European report here by ASE, the European Union institution. The Fundamental Rights Agency did a survey. UNICEF gave us some data from 2006, which is a little old. And then there's a German study which translates trauma-induced costs. And this is a very interesting one. And then there's one for Austria, the costs of domestic violence in Austria. And this one is the one I'm going to be telling you more about. But first, see, for instance, this EU data. It looks at intimate partner violence against women. And it costs us all, but we have no idea what is it about the children. So this data not useful if you want to look at the children. Then the Fundamental Rights Agency survey, it also asks, it did a survey of grown-ups and it asked them, how was it when you were a child? So it will give you data from children at earlier times. So these are some of these questions that were asked when you were below the age of 15. Would these things have happened to you when you were below the age of 15? Or you affected by sexual violence? And when you were below the age of 15, was the psychological violence? So this will look at the violence that was experienced by adults today against themselves, but this, witnessing violence in your home, it's not a part of these questions. Then the UNICEF data, as I said, it's old. So it's from 2006, and here it says it's even forthcoming in 2006. So here, what's good about it is that different countries, not just Europe, but it's also the Americas. And here these numbers, how many children are affected, which you can judge yourself if you think that's plausible. Here we don't know, how did they compare these numbers? Germany, 1 million, okay. We can't really. Austria, 82,000, seems not so much. Okay, so I was like a little skeptical about this. The Habeta paper that I mentioned, it's quite cool. They survey random people, and 14%, 15% of those surveyed stated that they experienced abuse or neglect of severe degree, okay? And then if you extrapolate this, then for the German population, for instance, you will see for the adults in Germany, this will be for 54 million, which is 7.8 million people today in 2009 that were affected by this violence. And then research will show you that 15 to 25% of those traumatized people will be affected long. So 14.5 are affected, and out of those, let's say 21%, like in the middle, will have long-term effects. So that would be 1.6 million people in Germany. It's more than the 1 million that UNICEF said, but it's not like crazy more, because usually the things that are measured are very direct, like they will measure the health costs, or they will measure costs for the legal system, the police, etc. But this Habeta study, it tries to get it all, the emotional effects and so on, like really the trauma that is endured in the lifetime of these people. So I think 1.6 million people is more than UNICEF said it would be. But then we talked also to experts and did expert interviews. And what was shocking to me was that all these experts said all these figures are very conservative, meaning that they should be much higher, actually. So we have the amount, the people affected, and now we look at the price. Okay, so how and what exactly are the costs? What do we include, and which perspective do we take? And of course, you want to be like, not just talk about Germany, but make international a model that works internationally. And where do we find the data for the prices? And so here's just some examples that we already talked about it. What is it that will be costly? So these bad experiences, they will, as Patricia said, maybe language development is halted. Then people are socially and emotionally impaired. Their health behaviors might be risky. They might die earlier, unable to unfold their life potential, because then maybe like due to unhealthy habits, or as Patricia said, self-medication in some examples, even the life years will stop. And in an economy that's really bad, if your labor force is not employed efficiently, that's a loss. So you could also look from the prevention side and say, okay, certain things can be done, like we could teach skills, we could help to strengthen these families, we could do all kinds of things, and they all have a price, and it's kind of like making these prevention prices what shows you how much these things are costing. Another good approach. Or you could look, usually it's difficult to do bottom up because the data is such a problem. So it would be some form of top down, and you could look at full costs, marginal costs. Like, you already have a police, and then if they have to come to violence in the home, okay, it just costs an extra visit, but you don't have to pay for the whole police force. And research-led estimations is usually a good thing because there are experts actually working at that, and they're doing a lot of research. These papers are quite complex, and there is a lot of literature on violence in the home, but what I found what's really interesting is there's not much literature on violence against children and the cost of that violence, which is astonishing. I thought there would be a huge field, but you can get through the reading rather quickly, which is good if you want to do research in the field, but it's actually quite shocking. Why isn't there any data? Why isn't there much research? So after I had done the literature survey and asked myself all these questions, I went back to the experts that I had identified from the literature and also from our network, and I asked them what to do and which costs I should choose, and should we make our own survey, or what should we do with the data that is aging? Should we just extrapolate it and say it's going to be the same in the future, or should we make data for each country, or can we just say if it's in Germany like this, it will be in Bosnia like that? And as we just heard, it's different numbers in Bosnia. So I've put all these things together, and then I said, okay, now I have to build this tool, right? Because I promised a tool. So I said already, it should be easily accessible. It should be clear and convincing. It should have good graphics, which I was not able to do that well. Because, for example, in the UK, there exists this nice map. It looks like a game kind of, and you can see what actually happened for this woman, Sarah, and how expensive these situations in her life became when there was domestic violence. And here's another train where you see what happens when there would have been no intervention. So you can see the costs are much higher if you don't step in. So this is a good thing, but I was not able to make an automatic game that would show us all this, but I like the graph. There's another example where it's pretty much the same, but it looks like this. Also a nice representation. Then I found this American example from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and this is what I really liked. You could choose a program, for instance, child parent centers, preschool and school age. You could choose that. You could choose a state. You could choose how many children there would be in that program, and then it would spit out some kind of like budget impact of the program, economic impact. I kind of wanted to do that. I thought that was cool. That thing though I found was a little bit complicated and intimidating. So I thought I should make it easier, but I like the idea of showing the societal costs and the costs per child. So I figured out the numbers for these countries by using Eurostat data. And then I used the Habete approach to find out how many people would be affected in that country. And then for the prices, I used purchasing power parities because Bosnia and Herzegovina is very different to Denmark, for instance. And the tool showed then results in the local currencies. It can be corrected for inflation. Yes, I have not done it yet, even though we have these crazy rates of inflation. And the second thing that is really important for the tool is what also the tool here for the US showed was I really wanted to focus on the program. See, if you make a program for X amount of euros, then how good is that going to be for eliminating potential costs and for actually improving the world? So this was really difficult because what is the multiplier, right? You know, how highly will your spending be multiplied by what factors? So there was even less literature on that, you know, the effectiveness of program to reduce violence against children. So I took what was there and then looked a little bit critically at it, asked my experts what they think and which things are most effective in their opinion, and found these multipliers and connected it. So here is just for, if you're interested, one meta-analysis where you can see certain programs and the idea how high the multiplier here is. Here it's 19 to 1 which is quite a lot. And I will give you those slides, and then you can look up the sources yourself and see if you need it for your work. Also, the idea, the chance that the benefits will exceed the cost, it always will exceed the cost. So this is a good thing to know. None of this money is wasted, right? None of it goes down into a sink. Okay, so let's see. Let me show you what I did and what the tool looks like. So you can enter the program cost, you can enter the number of children, you can find out the cost in the national currencies, also as a percentage of GDP, which I like as economists, and also look at the benefit side. And yeah, that is the tool which you can download or access from the webpage. And I wanted to, like, it's an Excel file, and many people get freaked out by Excel files. So there are only 4 things where you can enter stuff, always where the red arrows are. People can't change the file. So they can choose a country. Then once they did that, it will automatically tell you the country specifics. I will show you. And then they can enter the program cost per child, how many children will be in the program. And then they can just choose which things apply for the program, and the one scoring highest if the children that are targeted are high-risk children, especially those living in shelters. For example, let's do it. Say it's Germany, we have a program for 65 children, 3,000 euros per child. So let's see what's happening. So if you put Germany here, automatically it will tell you that violence that is experienced by children in the home is 0.5% of GDP every year. That's a huge figure that already, like, economists will be like, whoa, that is a lot of money. And this is pretty much the same in all these countries, off and on, depending, on the price level and the prevalence, really. But Lee Batchett found that the cost of discrimination against LGBT people in the US is 1% of GDP. So once again, you see, this is a very conservative number, right? It's all these children. So as my expert said, these estimations are really low. They're just low. So we're being very conservative here. We're not saying, whoa, exaggerating this problem. And then once they enter the cost, say 3,000 per child, 65 children in the program, you can see, wow, okay, the 3,000 spent per child is actually 20,000 as benefits. So there's quite a good multiplier. And this is because here we have these characteristics of the program. So you can play with these things and then just see, okay, if I do this, how much more benefits will my program generate? So the policymaker can say, hey, nearly 7,000 euros does it cost in Germany per year per child. So if you give me 3,000 per child, that's not so much. And we have a huge problem, so it's good to do something. And with these benefits, you get nearly 7 times more than you actually inputted. As I said, it's a very conservative estimation. It's scientifically based. And you can tell them it's not just nice to give this money for the children, but it's also economically very efficient to give money to childcare benefit programs. Yes, and that was my contribution to the GoFova project. And yeah, I'm ready for your questions and comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, both Dr. Schönpflug and Dr. Bell. That was, I mean, amazing. I really thought it was interesting how you're tying in both the health economics with the social ramifications of child abuse, and how that, contributes to not just current costs, but also future costs. When you mentioned, like, how, for example, that children learn from the abuse that they have, right? And then they tend to, have such traits as well in the future, right? Which prolong these costs. And so I was doing a little bit of research, because this is not my area of expertise in economics, but looking at, the US faces similar numbers in terms of incidences, right? We have about 25% of women who experience domestic violence, and 41% or so who experience interpartner violence. And on top of that, especially in the United States, where we do not have a country where medical debt is still an issue, right? We do have the problem of not universal healthcare system and high medical costs. And so on average, interpartner violence victims end up paying, about 30% of their own medical costs, right? Both in the actual like the medical costs, the physical medical costs, as well as mental costs. So how receptive has Europe in general been about targeting and figuring out ways to reduce domestic violence? Is it still stigmatized or not? Like, those are all the questions. I have a lot of questions, but basically it feels like in the United States is a very stigmatized thing, and it's not something we openly talk about. And there are huge ramifications, both personal, societal, and future generations.
Karen, shall I just say one or two things? Yes, I thought it was very interesting what you said. I just wanted to say about the cycle of violence theory, that it goes through generations. That there is always the possibility to build in resilience factors into a child's life. Not all children in any family will develop the same problems that they've grown up with. Some will, some won't. And then really we wanted to look at what is the input that you can have that might support children, because sometimes those patterns of repeated generational violence might also be a symptom of poverty, lack of education. I mean, there's a whole range of reasons why that might also be the case. I would say that domestic violence, it is being talked about more. There is quite a lot of publicity about it in Europe. It does get talked about, but then everybody thinks, well, that doesn't happen in my family. And there is also a social stigma, I would say, that people will think that that's something that happens to poorer families and not in well-off families. There's a lot of stigma. There's been some research done here that Karen might have heard of it as well, about domestic violence among female professors, that, if the higher the position you have, the more you will try and hide domestic violence. I mean, everybody will try and hide it. But so there is that kind of stigma. But I'll shut up now and let Karen have a word.
Yeah, you're really the expert in that field, Patricia. Like, for me, it was like, as an economist, that the projects kind of needed this position. So I was like, economics would be a good thing, to like unstigmatize something. It's usually just the feminists and the lesbians and God knows who talking about this as a problem. So I felt like economics, good, clean, scientific, all numbers, no soft spots. And then I was shocked to find that even in the economics literature, there's not much out there. There's very little data. There's very little data that's connected to costs. And then the literature that's there, it's either very, very technical. So it's just, looking at the method of calculating, but it seems bloodless. And then it is a huge taboo. And I feel there should be way more work done in that field, and also interdisciplinary work. Economics is maybe a good door opener, I feel, because you're saying, it's really inefficient to make these poor children suffer and to have unhealthy relationships. And then, you can get it over this like labor force, educational things, but just by itself, I think it hasn't changed much as being a taboo and being, as you said, something that needs to be hidden. It's shocking, yeah.
Yeah, and Jackie just sent a link about the cost of domestic violence as well in the United States or interpartner violence. And it's roughly, so I looked at this as well, it's roughly almost $5.8 billion, the last I saw, $5.8 billion per year in the United States for interpartner violence, where 4.1 of that, and this is not the associated cost of children, but 4.1 of that 5.8 billion, or maybe 5.1, was related to direct medical costs. And then additionally, you have the lost productivity, right? So that should be a signal. I mean, just that alone, just the numbers alone, besides the social consequences, right? The moral consequences that we have with this, right? And should stem this. And yet when you look at the news, it's simply just not there. And then again, this is not my field, but why is there such a discrepancy in terms of like women experience domestic violence versus interpartner violence, right? Like that, and like, does that confuse the messaging as well? Because I mean, I'm asking this because I'm curious and I'm not in this field, right? But there's a large discrepancy between 41% experiencing interpartner violence, right, and 25% experience domestic violence. So I don't know, like, where do you draw that? Like, what is the difference? And then what does that messaging convey, I guess?
Yeah, well, I'd like to say something about that. Yes. Domestic violence actually relates to violence, the location, that this is something that's happening in your home. And obviously interpartner violence can be, for example, violence, for example, at child handover from parents that have already separated. Or it could be ongoing stalking or a violent abuse where a relationship's been ended and one party refuses to accept that the relationship's over. But the terms get very often mixed up. Because the pattern of behavior, the problem is that you have a repeated pattern of behavior. That's the most important thing about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, that unlike an assault that happens to you on the street, this will be a pattern of behavior that is repeated over time and has then naturally, I didn't think about the costs of medical attention, because here we don't have that problem as much. That is, if you're suffering violence on a regular occasion, that's going to cost you an awful lot more in the long run. And I thought one of the things that I think is very important, because I didn't have a chance at the beginning to say, when we're talking about male perpetrators and female victims, of course, domestic violence can happen. Women can be perpetrators. It doesn't happen very often because the social structure isn't there really that promotes that kind of behavior. Whereas we do have a social structure that systematically discriminates women. I'm just thinking about equal pay. I mean, that's an issue in the United States, the same as it is here. But also, hang on a minute, let me just think if I can think of my train of thought again. Where was I going with this?
You were also maybe saying that domestic violence could also be between same-sex relationships and not,
yes.
Yes,
that's what did I say? It can be same-sex relationships as well. When we're talking about, male perpetrators and female victims, that is the largest problem that certainly is uncovered. It may be even more difficult for families, same-sex families, to admit to domestic violence. But there are support services available for that. Talking about, what was your question again, Iris? I'm sorry.
Oh, just the main question of like, how will this confuse the difference between, like, again, both are horrible. I'm not saying one isn't horrible or the other, saying both are horrible, but does that confuse the messaging when, we switch from interpartner violence to domestic violence, or how are they, like, correlated to such a degree that they are this, what I mean, like the same or not? Yeah. I don't know how to distinguish that. Really?
Well, the issue is that this is violence directed at women mainly, because the interesting thing is, if you looked at statistics of men's experience of violence and women's experience of violence, men are more likely to experience violence in public spaces than in private spaces, where women are subject to, if women are going to experience violence, it's more likely to be within their own home or the home of the perpetrator, so that this is going to be somebody that they're very intimately connected with. And it's also the case if you look at murders. That when women are murdered, they're more often murdered by somebody who knows them extremely well. Whereas, men, the statistics on male murder might be more to do with gang murders or something where it isn't that kind of level of relationship. So really, we're talking about a very gendered difference in violence, and those terms, intimate partner violence and domestic violence, are really terms that came up out of the women's movement 50 years ago and have become established as the problem of violence against women.
Yeah, I mean, Austria is a very specific case also with these murders. I think Austria is the only country in Europe where women are murdered more often than men, and murdered in by their partners or ex-partners, and that is really worrisome. You wouldn't think so. You would think Austria is like a nice country, but not in that respect. And then once again, if you think about the cost, being an economist, how much does it cost? This woman is now dead, right? There may be children, they don't have a mother. So, in the insurance terms, you would say, oh, person dead is like, say, €1 million. But, that is dreadful to just put it in these numbers. And then what happens to the children? So you can kind of add up and discount for future developments in the people's lives. And then also, like you said, the circle of violence for the next generation. I mean, these are very traumatizing experiences. And I am truly surprised how little is done in Austrian politics. Now we've had the 20th case in this year, and it's shocking, and the public is outraged. There are demonstrations each time now demanding something is being done. Nothing is being done. Very little public money is going to organizations that are working with women. Even less money is going anywhere else. Politics doesn't do anything, and we have a Green Party in the government, so that is surprising. No social responsibilities being taken, really none. Then we have huge gaps in the legal system, not just with the divorced parents and the children, but also like with stalking and cyber stalking. It only just came a couple of years ago that this is a criminal offense. I mean, it's insane. And then this whole like government spending, the priorities. If I'm seeing 0.5% of GDP each year are just being, lost, you would expect people wanting to close that gap, but no, not at all. It's surprising and also then very eye-opening, I would say.
Yeah, I was going to ask, and I don't want to monopolize any questions. If there are any questions, please raise your hand or type them out or anything like that. But I was going to ask about political support, because I know, like, for instance, the United States, it's not only stigmatized, but also, I mean, and a lot of countries, suffer with, the support for mental health and, mental health care needs and things like that. But also, like, on the political landscape, like, how supportive are politicians? Again, we see these costs, like, these are literal numbers we see, and yet we don't see much of a movement. And I don't know if that's because we just have a fragmented system, or is it just similar across nations, that this is something we just don't prioritize?
Well, women's shelters suffer from a chronic lack of funding. I mean, that is a problem across the board. If people are interested in looking at the issues surrounding the Istanbul Convention, which attempts to establish minimum standards for state provision in these fields, there is a commitment. But I think Britain's one of the countries that actually hasn't ratified it yet, because this would commit them to actually putting up hard cash for the spaces. And our issue looking at children was even more difficult, because although in Germany, for example, they have a quite comprehensive agreement about state funding of women's shelters, they fund what they call the core services, which is a roof over somebody's head, and maybe a telephone helpline for them to get in touch. But children's services are too often seen as an optional extra. And even in Germany, where I would say the provision, that women's shelters are well established, and there's a very strong tradition and a strong network of shelters throughout Germany. I mean, it's the same case in Austria as well. That the children's work might be dependent on volunteers, or maybe one professional childcare worker who is coordinating a series of volunteers to provide different activities. Now, this is important. Somebody should take the kids for a swim or whatever, but they really, the biggest help that children, help supporters children need, is somebody who will listen to them, and the space where they know they can talk about what is happening. They have a need to talk about it. They need to talk to other children, but they also need to talk to a sympathetic adult. And really part of the work of Gufova was trying to make the case that why children's work shouldn't be seen as an optional extra or a luxury, but rather it really needs to be part of the core funding and not at the expense of women.
Yeah, and then that also explains why the multiplier is so high, because simply we're starting at such a low level, there's nothing. So you do a little bit, it has a lot of effect because, you know, we're just going up that
Yeah.
curve, as we know in economics. And also you see like this, children are not worth anything. They have no advocacy. You can see it in how much is a childcare, like a kindergarten teacher paid, and how much is a university teacher paid who's working with adults. Like, you know, kindergarten teachers for shit pay, at least in Austria. And I was thinking, this is the most important job in society, bringing the future generation. Worth nothing, nearly nothing. And if you do it at home, it's not paid at all, right? So it is a systematic problem.
Yeah, it's definitely a neglected area. I mean, I think in most countries, and I want to thank you for bringing this to our attention and bringing this. Like when I heard you speak in the summer, I was just like, this is fascinating. Into the sense of, it's sad that we have to talk about this, but it's fascinating to bring this to light because this is a population and an impact that we often neglect, right? And both in terms of, you know, the women facing domestic violence and interpartner violence, that's neglected, but then even more so, right, the children outcomes and associated with that, right, is even further pushed down the line, which is just tragic in that sense. And there's a lot we can do about this. And I really want to thank you for being here. I do want to ask, are there any other questions or comments or? So again, thank you so much for your time. This will be posted to YouTube. And yes, I cannot thank you enough. And I'm going to do a lot more research on this myself as a health economist. And hopefully we can propel this issue further.
Thank you so much for inviting us here. This is really a great honor. And I must tell you a little secret. I'm not an expert in that field at all. Before working with Patricia, I have not done any research in this. So please apologize. I want to apologize for any mistakes I made. And you know,
no, like
everything, because you know, I'm like, so Iris, if you want to go ahead with the work, you know, let's do it, because it really needs it. And if you need your master thesis, PhD thesis, anyone, go for it. We need a lot more research here.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping when I was asking these questions. I'm not asking something that's very, I mean, they may be very naive, but it's like,
No.
I mean, how else do we get the message across, right? By studying something we may not be familiar with, but if you're passionate about it, right? Then that's why I was like, I'm hoping that my questions are not coming off as like, you know, too naive or too whatever you want to call it. But I'm just so intrigued by this and like motivated and passionate about it too. So I'm like, where else do we start? Like, this is clearly not my area, but just I think it's so fundamentally important for our society. So
yes, it is.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. And
yes, and thank you all for listening.
And I'll be in touch for sure.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.